Hello and welcome to the History of Total War Warhammer. This series of videos will guide you on a journey through the history of this game trilogy we all love oh so very much. We'll be going right back to the launch of Warhammer 1 and working all the way back up to today, where we're waiting for Warhammer 3, with Warhammer 2 being pretty much totally complete. Now without further ado, let's get into the history of Total War Warhammer, starting with the game that started it all, Total War Warhammer. The game was first announced on the 22nd of April 2015 with the legendary announcement cinematic, which is still the most viewed video on the Total War channel to this day, though the Warhammer 3 trailer is catching up quite rapidly. After this, there was a series of other trailers showcasing each legendary lord that was launching with the game and showing off the first ever factions to be in a Total War Warhammer game. These were of course Karl Franz and the Empire on the 17th of July, Thorgrim Grudgebearer and the Dowie on the 4th of September, Kolek and the Warriors of Chaos on the 22nd of October, Grimgar Ironhide and the Greenskins on the 25th of November, Manfred von Karstein and the Vampire Counts on the 15th of March, now getting into 2016, and finally, a Welcome to the Old World trailer on the 14th of April. Funnily enough, this is a naming convention they have kept with right up until now with the Welcome to the World of Kislev and Khorne trailers. The game was launched on the 24th of May 2016, and it instantly became the fastest selling Total War game in history, with the first few days pulling in over 500,000 sales. It was also reviewed highly with an average of 8 or 9 out of 10 from all major outlets, and to this day has a Metacritic of 86%. According to Steam charts during the launch, the peak players were over 111,000, but today it's normally down in the low 600s and is dropping every month. Players quickly fell in love with the more casual Total War gameplay. It's no secret that the Warhammer games are much more friendly to newer Total War players, with more simplified campaign gameplay to make room for the unique faction mechanics, as minor as they may have been back then. You simply had gold to manage, and buildings clearly stayed what they did for you, without having to worry about food or managing a royal court or family. This is initially what drew me to the series, as I tried some of the Total War games, but got lost in the more complex mechanics that my young zoomer mind could not comprehend. Warhammer made it all easy, with more of a focus on the spectacle of the world you were in and the wars you could wage, rather than the intricacies of true empire management. Of course, Warhammer and general fantasy players also felt more at home, with each faction feeling diverse and totally different from any other, both in terms of looks and gameplay. Little touches like the music and UI being slightly different per faction went a long way into making it feel like a new experience every single time you picked up a new faction. Now, the factions and campaign were of course extremely simple back then. There was no story mode like the Vortex we have now, so it was really just a sandbox where you had to dominate the world to win, which was just fine for a while. But with a world like Warhammer, the stories are just important as a spectacle. But that wouldn't really come into things until later in time. For now, we were stuck with the one campaign contained to the old world. The factions did have their own mechanics, and you can even go back and play Warhammer 1 today to see this, since no reworks have been applied to the old game, making it into somewhat of a time capsule. The Empire were by far the most basic, with only Empire officers setting them apart from the rest. The Dwarves were a slightly more complex faction, with the Great Book of Grudges mechanic basically being your faction gets mad when others do it wrong. Aside from this, they could also utilise the Underways, making them into one of the first factions to have a unique movement stance. The Greenskins were set up as the antagonists to the Dwarves, with access to the same Underway movement stance to allow them to navigate the difficult mountain terrain they found themselves in. They also had access to the War, though in its more basic format. Upon an army reaching maximum fightiness from constant battling, a secondary army would spawn and follow around the parent until either killed or a drop in fightiness occurred. Finally, the Vampire Counts were the antagonists to the Empire and had what I believe to be the most unique mechanics at launch. They had vampiric corruption as well as the ability to raise the dead, which are a little tame by today's standards, but were incredibly unique back then and are the reason why I got into the game in the first place. Of course, we also had the Warriors of Chaos, but they were technically a DLC, so I won't be covering them until next week. Now, all of these factions are bare bones in comparison to the ones we have today, but back then, having a Total War game with non-human factions was revolutionary, which I believe contributed hugely to the game's success. If the same game launched today with the context of a game like Warhammer 2, I really do believe it wouldn't do as well, simply because of the nature of it. So one of the main things that caused my interest to drop in this game, the factions were too basic and the campaigns had no direction aside from the expand as much as possible before Chaos arrived. The game also brought a whole new type of gameplay to the multiplayer and battling scene. Before, players were limited to the classic rock paper scissors of front lines, ranged units and cavalry. Now there were entirely new classes of units to worry about. There were monsters that could waltz through enemy lines with ease. There were flying units that could get to your ranged units no matter where you placed them. There was magic to punish your troops and empower your enemies. And perhaps the most controversial of all, there were lords and heroes that could take on entire units and sometimes entire armies with ease. People on both sides of this argument were passionate that either it was one of the things that set the Warhammer games apart from the rest, or the thing that made them into stupid, unrealistic nonsense fests. But if you complained about that, then you might want to take a look at the monsters, the vampires, the greenskins, and the entire faction of dwarves with giant beards. I'm more on the former side of this argument, obviously, but regardless, this new breed of battling did have some areas that were somewhat lacking. Battle maps on the whole were quite small to make up for the fact that the models were much more detailed. This meant they had to restrict the map size and by default the army size to allow the game to run at an acceptable standard. This meant if you had multiple armies on both sides, the maps were cramped if you could get them to work at all, as the frame drops were just out of this world. And of course, the crowning achievement of all Total War disappointment, and something we hope to be rectified very soon, sieges. The same problem as regular maps, small and cramped with too many armies. More problems on top of this, however. Only ever 1 or 2 directions to defend from, towers that had limited firing arcs, single-tiered defences, walls with teleportation technology, though there's hardly enough reason to get on them in the first place, and I could go on, but you get the idea that compared to older games, the sieges here were just flat out bad. Nevertheless, Warhammer 1 was a true landmark in the landscape of Total War games, and even strategy games in general, and the development cycle taught both CA and the community a lot about what it takes to make a good and even great fantasy game, even if they missed the mark on their first swing. But that's all for a later time, since that about covers everything that came in this first installment of the history of Total War Warhammer. If you enjoyed this video, then be sure to leave it a like, and if you want to see more videos like this, then be sure to subscribe, hit the bell notification so you never miss a video. I'd like to take this time to thank all supporters of the channel, in particular Copacedo and Your Boy LC, for their outstanding support at the Clean Ones tier. Thank you all so very much for watching, and for now, I've been COLONELDAMNEDERS, and I will see you next turn.